And the truth is, and I talked about this early, as much as it seems like this would be an awfully hard week to do the top 10, guys, it's really not. You know why? Stuff doesn't move from
Yeah.
last week. My top 10 is going to look almost exactly the same in a lot of respects with a couple movements because the teams, teams struggled really bad and looked really bad. But you know what? The team right behind them also looked really bad, and the team behind them looked really bad.
And then somebody
And
lost,
nobody
so it's
looked
academic.
and nobody behind them looked good enough to jump them. And there's just a couple teams that lost. So, you know, I sent it to you, but we'll walk through it. This week's top 10 is actually a lot like last week's top 10, and it's almost sort of sitting in a holding pattern for the major games to come.
I've been going first, but why don't you go first this time?
Sure. So my number one, it should shock nobody, is Georgia. Georgia offensively is still a highly efficient offense with Stetson Bennett. He had a deep ball. Defensively, it's hard to comment much more. They lose. Maybe some people thought their best player on the edge due to legal trouble didn't skip a beat because of it. Run game and the passing games together. The one thing I'll say to Daniel's point, JT Daniels came into that game, and I don't know if it's injury or rust, but he didn't look great. So this idea that there's this other offense waiting in the wings, I've been skeptical because it's like week 10 and we haven't seen it yet, and I don't think it exists. I think that is what Georgia is, and I think Smart knows that that is more than enough to win the national title this year given the rest of the slate. And the rest of the slate, to me, starts with number 2, and people are going to be mad, but tell me why you should jump them, is Alabama. I thought that game against LSU was a disaster. The offensive line looked atrocious. And if they were to play, let's say, Ohio State today, Alabama probably would have lost to Ohio State. Maybe could have lost to Cincinnati. Oklahoma would have lost to like Texas A&M. I think this was a much worse game than they played against Texas A&M. But this was the worst game they played. And I'm not sure in a week's time, when they figure out what to do with the offensive line with your injury situation they had early in the game today, that they aren't a better team. And there have been plenty of weeks where Alabama looked like they would have beaten anybody else in the country. So I can't justify dropping them, especially given that Ohio State, my number 3, didn't look a whole lot better against Nebraska. Now, they looked less incompetent, but their offense is still very sputtery. They still leave a lot of yards that they don't convert into points. This defense still has significant lapses, and that was not, I don't care what people say, is not a great Nebraska team. They are pretty good defensively. They're not elite, but offensively, they're not great. And they've had close wins because a lot of teams they've played have been in struggle mode, like Oklahoma. And because of the struggle mode, moving on to my number 4 pick and my number 5 pick. Number 4 for me is Cincinnati. Number 5 is Oklahoma. Rounding out the undefeated list here, Cincinnati did not look great today, even though they won. And this is now 3 games in a row, Navy, Tulane, and Tulsa, where they've been close games. I know Tulane was 31-12, but that was very close into the fourth quarter. Cincinnati is not putting away low-tier competition. Tulsa fumbled the ball diving for the goal line, or would have had a chance to tie that game. I have to have them there because they're undefeated, because I think the defense is very good and because of where everyone else is. And I think they're a good team. It showed early in the year. But how they're playing right now for the past few weeks, they would lose, I think, to someone like Texas A&M or Michigan or Oregon on a regular basis. Oklahoma is on bye. Not going to spend much time with them. The Kansas game is just 2 games ago. I want to see them play some, all their ranked teams are at the end of their schedule. Every single ranked team they play. I need to see how that ends for them. My number 6 is Texas A&M. Texas A&M soundly beat Auburn, and it took a long time to get there, but that is a very good defense. That is an offense that has a good run game. Playing an Auburn defense that is a very, very good defense, I'll note, and is very good against the run. They were able to get points on the board, able to put it away, and I don't know a whole lot of other teams playing better football right now. And you compare them to my number 7, Michigan. I think Texas A&M is a good notch or 2 better defensively than Michigan, even though Michigan's good. They're not as good as A&M right now. Michigan might be better offensively. They're really similar in a lot of ways. Michigan has limitations at quarterback. Michigan is very dependent upon Corum and a couple of skill players to make basically their whole offense. just like Texas A&M is. I think Texas A&M is just a better version of those things right now. I know Texas A&M has their 2 losses. They have the win over Alabama. Michigan right now doesn't really have anything on their resume. I think Wisconsin is the only team with a winning record that Michigan's actually beaten. So it's hard for me to rank them much higher than they are. Oregon is my number 8. They had a narrow win against Washington. Look, I don't love Oregon. Okay. I just don't love Oregon. They continue to struggle off and on. They struggled for a lot of the game against Washington. They scored a cheap touchdown late in the game. I think kind of playing for style points. It's hard to take that any other way. But good defense, good run game. They've had some guys out, but still decently sound. Anthony Brown, I don't think is a very good quarterback for this level of competition, but he's enough to get the job done. And with their defense, they can beat a lot of the middling teams because at this point, we're starting to deal with teams that aren't great. And to that point, number 9, it's Notre Dame. Notre Dame, I don't know that Notre Dame on an average, if they play their average B game and they play like Ohio State and they have their average B game, that Notre Dame can stay on the field. Even though those Alabama, Ohio State, Cincinnati's, Oklahomas don't look that consistently great, Notre Dame is just a solid team that can beat a USC or a North Carolina or a Virginia Tech on a consistent basis by like 10 points. And right now, that's enough to get you 9th in the country in my list. And I think it's a real testament to what Brian Kelly does. And I know maybe Daniel will talk about it. We think Kelly's a fantastic coach, that he's able to produce these teams with, and produce these records despite the fact that Notre Dame is not an overwhelmingly talented team this year. And my 10th place team is Michigan State. You still got to get credit for beating Michigan. I picked Purdue outright in a podcast I was on for Kelly Ford ratings. Pick them to beat Michigan State. It was a terrible matchup for Michigan State. Purdue only throws the ball. Michigan State is a straight up bad back 7. But when you look at the rest of the country, I just don't know who I'd put ahead of them. Maybe Ole Miss, but we're at the point now where I think Ole Miss is just a shell of a team. So that's my top 10. I've spent enough time talking about it. Turn it over to Daniel.
Yeah, and I'll note that there's a lot of people in the comments that are killing you for, like someone said, Alabama struggled with LSU today, but Texas Tech has a similar record and Oklahoma beat them really bad. Oklahoma barely beat Kansas. Y'all, that is such a non-starter for me. The fact that Oklahoma fans do not have the appreciation for what happened against Kansas, Tulane, who is now 1-8, like this is beyond comprehension for me. That's like you just forget that happened. That you needed a miracle play on 4th and 1 to not give Kansas the ball with a chance to win with 3 minutes left in the game. Yeah, Kansas is terrible. Texas Tech, before you go, Josh, Texas Tech, they didn't play an out-of-conference Power 5 team, right? Their 2 Power 5 wins were a 3-point win over West Virginia and a win over Kansas. That's it. They beat Houston, SFA, and FIU. So Texas Tech is not in the same universe as even a banged-up LSU. Please stop with that. I hate that I have to defend Alabama on a night when they look like trash, and I don't think they deserve any defense. But can we go back 2 weeks where you almost lost to Kansas, who is really bad?
Texas Tech gave up 70 points to Texas. 70 points. People are going to – we talked about this early in our show, and I'm going to flip it back to you. But look, guys, don't just say like X team shouldn't be here, Y team shouldn't be there, and certainly don't do the game you're playing there where you're saying, oh, let me compare. LSU is by far Alabama's worst game of the year this week, and they deserve to be criticized for it. But it was their worst game of the year. They still won, and LSU is still a team that would beat Texas Tech by 3 or 4 touchdowns.
Yeah, so and that's my thing is just like you said, like it's not just Alabama in a vacuum. Alabama looked terrible tonight, awful. But Nebraska is 3-7 and played really a 1-score game against Ohio State, right? Like Wake Forest lost, Michigan State lost. Like, so we talk about how like if you played a bad game against Kansas, had you been playing a team with a pulse that day, you would have lost, right? Well, now you're doing that for Alabama in a win against LSU, and I think it's laughable. That's where we are. All right, here's my top 10. Sorry, that was my rant. Georgia number 1. I have Ohio State number 2. I just said, they struggled against Nebraska. They looked bad against Nebraska. And I'll be honest, Nebraska's 3-7, but Nebraska does have a good defense. That was a road game. I'm not going to kill them too much. And I think that even though I don't love the inefficient scoring, they had their act together more than Alabama. Now, with Alabama, they already were struggling with injuries in the offensive line and having to shuffle pieces. When you lose your center, there's a lot that can go haywire, and I think that affected them a lot tonight, but I am dropping them a spot, swapping them with Ohio State right now. I think if those two teams played tonight, Alabama would have lost. I think that if they played last week, Alabama might have won, but this is this week, not last week. I've moved Oklahoma up from unranked to number 4, and that has a lot to do with the fact that everybody else looked really bad. And I think this notion that we should reward Cincinnati, who I have number 5, and ignore the fact that they've had a 3-game stretch of Navy, 1-7 or 1-8 Tulane with their 3rd-string quarterback, and Tulsa. Those 3 games, Navy, Tulane, and Tulsa, all losing records. They couldn't separate themselves from any one of those 3 teams. Imagine if they had a stretch like Ohio State has coming up or Alabama had early in the year. There's no way they're undefeated, but they are undefeated, so I have number 5. Number 6, I have Oregon. People are killing Oregon right now because Washington lost to Montana State to start the year. Washington, Oregon, if you're gonna give Ohio State credit for Penn State getting up for them because it's a rivalry game, even though Penn State isn't great this year, Washington, Oregon, if y'all don't follow Pac-12 football, that is a rivalry game. Those two fan bases hate each other. Those two teams get up for one another. Washington has a good defense. I'm not killing Oregon too much for winning a close game against Washington. Number 7, I have Texas A&M. They had a 17-point win today over a ranked team. It's a bigger win spread than Penn State did against Auburn. Auburn has shown to have a pulse this year. I think that's a quality win for them. I have number 8, Notre Dame. And everybody's forgotten about Notre Dame. But what did they do today? They won like 34-7 against the Navy team that only lost by 7 points to Cincinnati. If Notre Dame didn't lose that game to Cincinnati, they would be in the top 4 right now. Full stop. I don't love their schedule, but everybody else has all these warts. So does Notre Dame, but Notre Dame's been winning. Others like Michigan State didn't win today. Wake Forest didn't win today. So I got Notre Dame there. This is where people are going to get super mad because of head-to-head. I've got Michigan number 9, Michigan State number 10. 2 things. 1, by definition, Michigan's loss is better than Michigan State's. By definition. Michigan lost to a higher-ranked team. 2, Michigan lost an incredibly close game on the road to Michigan State. That game on a neutral field, based on how Vegas does everything, Michigan probably wins that game. So I've got Michigan number 8, Michigan State, or number 9, Michigan State number 10. Y'all can kill me because you love head-to-head. But Purdue is not a great loss, especially I think it was a double-digit loss. They were never in that game, really. Purdue's not a great loss for the number 3 team in the country. That's my top 10. Josh, tell me what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're pretty closely aligned. The truth of the matter is it's really hard right now to do, especially the back half of the top 10. And the other thing I'll say is, particularly in the Big 12 and the Big 10, you've got a round robin between the top teams, right? Baylor, Oklahoma State, Oklahoma, or Michigan State, Michigan, and Ohio State. And particularly in the Big 10, those games playing themselves out are really going to determine what the top 10 looks like. And to a certain degree, we're kind of estimating on quality and we're estimating on resume because none of these teams can really fill out the resume until they finish the back end of their schedule. The one thing that does seem really clear, given the wins and losses, is that if you win out, most everybody on this list, if you win out, you're in good shape. The exception to that really is Texas A&M. Because the fact that they lost those 2 games and because Alabama and Georgia are both in the SEC, they're in, obviously if Alabama wins out, Texas A&M's just kind of sunk. unless they get help. But otherwise, Cincinnati can easily sneak into the playoffs this year. There's a pretty good potential for Oklahoma, Ohio State, Michigan, all these teams to knock themselves out. So everything's definitely up on the table. I think it's interesting to talk about. I think the point of the sport is entertainment, and we should be willing to talk about it. But at the same time, 2 points as always. One, this is for fun. We're trying to rank the top 10 teams. We're very aware of the fact that we don't know enough to really rank them. And the fun thing is we are going to find that out in the next few weeks, which is nice. We're not going to have to be totally hypothetical here. We're going to see a lot more data points that's going to help us be considered. And two, for all you people that wanted to hate it or criticize it, tell me all the teams that should be ahead of these top 10 teams. Because the truth is, everybody looked like garbage today. And stop talking about how, I don't know who you want to point to, right? Like Ohio State versus Nebraska, or if you want to talk about, Cincinnati today and their close win, which we did some. Those have been off and on, but it's one game, and they've had a lot of other games where they look dominant. Alabama in particular, this was their worst game of the season, and we'll see if their offensive line fixes itself, but I'm by no means ready to define them by their worst game of the season.
Well, and Josh, somebody said Notre Dame is not a top 10 team. And it's like, okay, but right behind them is like, who else are we going to put there? Wake lost to an unranked team. BYU's got 2 losses and they beat up on Idaho State today. West Virginia is 4-5. That was Oklahoma State's loss. Like, I feel like Notre Dame has been out of sight, out of mind because they've been playing good brand names that aren't ranked teams, but they're doing things that a lot of people aren't doing, and that's winning. And if intellectually we are going to put, and maybe this says something, and maybe you can touch on this, like we want to put Cincinnati in the top 5, right? We want to put them in the playoffs. We want to say they're a playoff team, but went wire to wire with Notre Dame, and Notre Dame's not a top 10 team. Doesn't that say more bad about Cincinnati than it does anything else about Notre Dame?
Yeah, I think so. Look, the reality is, if you look at the top 25 rankings, at least in my view, the 2 teams you could really consider for it are Ole Miss and Oklahoma State. Ole Miss right now is not a fantastic team. They beat Liberty by 13. Liberty's a reasonably good team. I mean, they're not really a top 25 team, but they're competent. But Ole Miss is a shell of a team. They've got 2 losses. They did lose to Auburn, and I can't put them that high. And then Oklahoma State, Oklahoma State probably has the next best argument, and I just don't necessarily love them as a football team. So for me, it's Notre Dame, Michigan State, or Oklahoma State. I'm not sure Oklahoma State really has a better argument than Notre Dame does, but that's your comparison. Some people might want to put UTSA, but again, I need to see them actually play any top 70 team. I'm not talking like top half of P5. I mean top 70 team.
Well, and 2 weeks ago, people were ready to put SMU up there because they just want a G5 to be good, better than they are. I mean, look, UTSA, the best win they have is either a 7-point win over Illinois, or, well, that's it. That's their best win. But they have a 1-score win over UNLV, a 1-score win over Western Kentucky. I just can't imagine. They beat MTSU 27-13, Memphis 31-28. Like, I can't imagine a team that has now 4 struggle wins against borderline terrible teams, bad G5s, not bad teams, bad G5s. We're going to put them in the top 10 just because they got a clean record.